It's episode 2. We are officially kicking off our F40 build. How do we up the ante from episode 1? Well, how about with episode 2, we have 2 F40s. We're going to go get our hands on a complete road-going car so we can pull all sorts of measurements off of it. That's where this project begins. We've got to rewind. This is not where it starts. We got to build this entire chassis table and set the body up on it. And I want to make sure it is all true, square, plumb, and all that kind of stuff because we're here to build the best possible car that we can. And I promised I was going to show you every single step of the way, including the foundations. This is going to be a good one. We're going to cover every single detail possible. And that starts with another F40. Let's go do it.
Today, we're heading over to IM Detailing. This is one of Costa Mesa's premier detailing facilities, and one glance around the inside of the shop will immediately tell you we are in the right place. If the Lamborghini Diablo doesn't grab your attention, I'm gonna guess that the F40 stuffed into the corner will. If somehow that isn't your cup of tea, well, there's still a lot of other cars lurking around this shop, and all of them are worth admiring. But the car we're here to see today, of course, is this Ferrari F40. This car is here for the IM Detailing treatment, a concours-level detail that covers the entirety of the car. Work like this puts this car at the top of its class, and it's a stark reminder that I'm never going to own anything this nice in my life. But I digress. The reason that we're here for this car today is to get measurements off of its bodywork. We want to make sure that we set our car up to match, and given that this particular example is Ferrari Classic A certified, we know that we can trust any measurements we pull off of it because it's more or less as good as it gets. We're going to measure across the car from hard point to hard point, and then take that data back to our shop for our project at home.
Now, for the hard points that I want to take off of this car, I want to keep it simple. Yes, we could 3D scan the whole thing if we wanted every bit of information possible, but obviously we're in a detailing shop. I'm not going to spray ASAP spray all over this car. That doesn't make sense to do. We're going to leave everything as we found it. And honestly, we only need a couple of measurements to make this successful. And I'm basing it off of the rocker panels of this car. The rocker panel right here up to the quarter panel, it's one piece and it's the same on both sides of the car. So if we measure a few hard points side to side, we'll know that our car is going to be set up correctly. Because if you think about what we have here, the hood, it's a fixed dimension. It tells us its width already. We don't really have any malleability with the hood. We can't deform it or change it. It tells us what its size is. And the same thing goes with the roof or the rear clamshell, but there's a lot riding on these rocker panels. And so what I want to do is make sure that we have the rocker panels set up correctly, not only on their overall width, but on their fore and aft taper. We could fix the rear end. We want to make sure that the front end is angled correctly, that it's going the right way. And then more important than that even is getting everything set up correctly on the vertical axis. So I want to make sure that we have the right pitch and lean, that they're plumb or however kind of what angle they need, because these things are flexible. They have a lot of kind of twists to them. We can move them around a lot. And so if we do something like measuring the front width of these rocker panels, the rear, and then get a hard point maybe up here on the corner, and we make sure that those dimensions are the same on our car, we know that we are accurate and the car is going to turn out correctly once we get it all done. We don't want to get further down the road and find that the doors don't fit correctly, or that pieces of window trim aren't correct, or that, you know, maybe our A-pillars aren't spread at the correct dimension. We want to get this car absolutely accurate, and there's no better way to do that than to come and measure a Classic A certified F40.
And so with some of Anthony's help, that's exactly what we did. Carefully measuring from one side of the car to the other anywhere that we could pass the tape measure through. Is this a perfect science? No, there's definitely a potential for error here. But honestly, we'll measure twice and we don't need true perfection. We just need to be in the ballpark, and then everything should fall into place once we're back at the shop.
Okay, so inside it's the duct. We're going to use stupid American units and go with 45 and 3/8 exactly. And then of course there's the need to get this tape measure out without scratching anything. I've never been more careful retracting a tape measure in my life.
Now, one major perk to being in Costa Mesa is that this isn't the only F40 that we have access to. Believe it or not, there are 3 or 4 of them within a mile of the shop. That's Southern California for you, but regardless, it's still spectacular to see one up close, and so we had to spend a little bit of time appreciating the details that make this car what it is, whether those details are perfect, or if they're the kind of details that make this car clearly, well, a race car.
Anthony, that's enough footage. We've got to go. Let's let them do their thing here and go build an F40.
So with our F40 measurements out of the way, we need to rewind the clock all the way back to June of this year, because keep in mind, this project has been in the works for 9 months. After I purchased the first round of F40 body parts, I knew that we were going to need a chassis table to do this build correctly. And so one of the very first phone calls that I made was to our friends over at Send Cut Send. Not only is the chassis going to need a lot of laser cut parts and pieces, it turns out we're going to need those before we even get started. But thankfully, Send Cut Send was up for the task of designing and cutting a complete chassis table for this project. To pull it off, I laid out a handful of requirements. I needed the overall length and the width to support an F40. And on top of that, I wanted a 24-inch overall deck height and some free span sections in the center, so that I could climb in the middle of this chassis table and get to building and welding when the time comes.
So in this box is 1,500 pounds of steel, and it's going to take a lot of work to put all of these pieces together, because essentially what we have are 7 individual fabrication tables that interlock. And we're going to be able to build them all perfectly flat, true, square, and then configure them however we want. This entire system is going to be expandable if we decide we need it in the future. And Send Cut Send really went out of their way to design this thing in a way that's going to be perfect for our project. And it's going to be nuts when it's done. We've got kind of some under table supports. These will span side to side. We've got huge 2 by 3 foot table tops in here with a 5/8 hole grid on top. I mean, it's basically what you guys are used to seeing me build on top of on steroids. And I don't even know how we're going to go about actually getting this whole thing built, but it's going to be insane.
Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys already know exactly what a fixture or chassis table is, and if you do know, you're welcome to skip ahead. But if you want the refresher, or if you're new here, let me give you the rundown. We need a reasonably precise and flat surface to build our car on top of. With that, we also need a way to hold all of our parts and pieces firmly in place. And so, using Fusion 360, this entire table was designed using all flat parts and pieces. We're utilizing tab and slot construction in order to fit all of these pieces together, and the finished result should be a perfectly square and flat table and work surface. There are a lot of advantages to building the table in this method. One, it's pretty hard to mess up. It's almost guaranteed that if we have the parts fitted together properly, it will turn out correctly. Two, it's incredibly strong and rigid. And perhaps most importantly for point number 3, this entire table is laser cut from flat 1/4-inch plate steel. That means it can be flat packed shipped to us for assembly, and that makes my partners at Send Cut Send absolutely perfect for this task. In fact, if you want to build a table just like this one, or utilize their services to build literally any other part of your project, you should absolutely head to sendcutsend.com/StanceWorks and utilize their 15% off discount for your next order. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Send Cut Send services are one of the best tools in my toolbox, and without their help on this project, I wouldn't be tackling it at all. So go show them some love, and let's thank them for coming to the table both literally and figuratively. With the entire table slotted together, it's finally time to weld it up. We could TIG weld this, as it's typically all we do on this channel, but given that I started with 7 of these tables and ended up with 10 of them to weld together, I decided busting out the old Miller 211 MIG welder was the right tool for the job. But given that heat introduces distortion, it was important for me to check every single joint with a square after every weld. I kept everything clamped firmly into place and made any adjustments necessary because, again, we want to make sure this table is as straight as possible. After days of welding, it's finally time to assemble all of our individual tables into one giant surface. We can get them laid out on the concrete shop floor and get them reasonably close, but once we go to tighten everything together, it's gonna take some serious care. But thankfully, StanceWorks came up with a creative idea on how to get these pieces lined up more or less perfectly. They spec'd some precision ground 5/8 dowels that can go between the tables as we tighten them together. And because all of the holes in these tables are laser cut and therefore accurate, it gets these tables frighteningly close to straight right out of the gate. Only tiny adjustments were needed once we got this thing turned over. Attached to the bottom of each leg is a very heavy-duty caster. Every single one of these wheels is designed to independently support 1,400 pounds. I chose them because you never know what might wind up on top of this table in the future, and because these heavy-duty casters make it a lot easier to push around the table solo when I'm in the shop by myself. But thankfully, I was not alone this day. It took a crew of us to get this table flipped over successfully and onto its wheels. In fact, trying it by hand, we quickly realized this was not going to work without putting our feet at serious risk of getting crushed. So we got out the gantry and decided to do this the somewhat responsible way. The second half of the table was a much bigger challenge considering it had the center section already bolted to it. It was a lot heavier and a bit more unwieldy, but with some crafty wrapping from our straps, we managed to get it lined up, flipped over, and got both halves fully attached. This is, of course, where we had to take great care to make sure all of the surfaces were completely flat on the top side. We don't want any steps or grooves or anything that could upset a level from sitting flat on the work surface, because again, we're going to use this to reference as we build the chassis. As mentioned a moment ago, I began with 7 of these segments, which you see here, but ultimately decided to expand it out to 10. As you can see, this thing is huge. It's an absolute behemoth, and I have no idea what it actually weighs, but when I say this thing is stout and sturdy, you have no idea. It measures out to 12 feet long and 7 feet wide, and if you're asking me, this is now officially one of the coolest tools in the shop. So our chassis table is built, and we're finally at the point of this episode where we get to start playing with some Ferrari pieces. First thing on the list is to just get these parts set on the table and start mocking them up. This is ultimately what we'll be basing the entire project and build around. It is our only guideline. It'll define our inner and outer boundaries in 3D space for what we have to work with, and thus it will be defining both looks and function. To do that, I'll introduce our first chassis table specific tooling. I use StanceWorks to cut and bend a number of these stands that can support the body off of the table and get locked to the grid itself. I made them in varying heights so that we can get the body set up correctly because ultimately this is going to define our ride height. I'm basing that ride height off of the road car we measured earlier, but also off of aerodynamic suggestions from a few friends that know more than I do. Now, before anybody gets up in arms in the comments, no, the process you're seeing at the moment is not the final lineup. This is simply getting everything set up for a baseline. There's going to be a lot of fine-tuning from this point forward, and a decent bit of that fine-tuning is going to require utilizing a chassis table and some custom tooling.
So this chassis table is 12 feet long. It's pretty big, but a car is longer. Could we make a longer table? Sure, it's modular, not a problem, but that starts to get really cumbersome and I don't think it's necessary. But what I do need to figure out is how to support the pieces of the car that kind of hang over each end. We've got a front clamshell and a rear clamshell that need some support. Well, after thinking about it for a long time, I decided to just buy a bunch of 80/20. And if you don't know what this is, it's aluminum extrusion. It's really lightweight, really strong, really straight, and they make all sorts of just kind of different clamps and pieces that attach to it. So we can build a structure out of this stuff that attaches to our chassis table that we can then fixture to, we can attach other pieces to, and most importantly, we can adjust it and have it support our front and rear clamshells exactly where we need them to be, and it's not going to break the bank.
I suppose it's worth being transparent in that 80/20 is not cheap, but this is cheaper than some alternatives. Importantly, it pairs really well with our chassis table and gives us even further modularity to accomplish the goals at hand. We're also going to use a bit of 80/20 to support the leading edge of the roof, but we're going to get there here in a handful of minutes, so stay patient. Before we get there, we've got to get the rest of our panels lined up. We use the 80/20 out back to build a support for the rear clamshell, but the clamshell itself attaches to the roof. So there's an order of operations to this, and we want to get as much of it right as we can. While there's more aligning to do, with at least some understanding that we have the body somewhat straight on the table, it's time to get that rear clamshell fitted into place. It's here that the adjustability of our tail support comes into play. I want to be able to pitch the rear end up and down and left and right in order to get everything gapped correctly. It was also kind of tough to decide exactly where I should be supporting this tail end from, but eventually we found the sweet spot that keeps it balanced, and it's safe to say this thing is finally starting to look like an F40. Clearly, we're getting closer, and a lot of these pieces are, of course, intended to fit together, but without a structure underneath them to actually support them, it's actually kind of surprising that it looks as much like a car as it currently does. I fully expected to have to build a steel substructure to support all of these panels just to start building the chassis itself, but honestly, it doesn't look like we're going to have to do much of that. In an ideal world, we'll start building the crash structure for the car first, and then go to the body.
How are we going to get there? Well, all of these kind of mounts that exist, all these tabs and all these mounting holes that are on the bodywork, there's not a ton, we're going to have to add some. We're going to need 3 axes of adjustment on all of it. We're going to need to pull the rear in, out, up. We're going to have to adjust everything. We're going to have to kind of bow and flex things to really get it perfect, because it's not an exact science and these panels are super far from perfect. So right now the goal is just get us in the neighborhood so that we know we're in the right place roughly. We can start building some structure inside of this thing, and then the tabs that come off and meet some of these pieces, and as we add mounting provisions, we can start adding axes of adjustment, degrees of movement in them, so we can get it perfect when the time comes.
Now, I touched upon it in the last episode, but one remaining variable that we have to solve is the fact that we don't have A-pillars for the F40. The original ones are steel and are part of the chassis, which I don't want. But thankfully, we can pull molds off of my 244 GTK because it happens to have the same pillars and windshield frame, and we can transplant a carbon replacement onto the F40. But we're going to need some adjustment with the roofline in order to get it all lined up and perfect, and that's why we've built this 80/20 frame. It'll give us a bit of movement up and down, left and right, to get everything lined up and perfect, given that we don't have a reference on hand.
So as you guys saw, we had just like a pole jack under here before to support the roof as we're getting it set up. Not really a permanent solution. Biggest reason being, although it's adjustable and it works really well for this, I'm gonna have to move this table. And so given that that's planted off the floor, it makes the whole thing immobile. And then this thing is stuck in position unless I want to find an alternative. So we're going to use some more small 80/20 and basically build an adjustable rig so that we can adjust the roof height and it's anchored to the table so the table can still move around, whether we want to move it into the middle of the shop or because we have to move shops.
That's getting us pretty close to having the body fully set up on the chassis table, at least for what I'd call the rough draft. It's far from the final, but we're getting somewhere at least. The last part to go on the car is the rear underbody that we covered in the last episode, my favorite piece of the car, and if you somehow missed the story behind it, you've got to go back and watch the previous one, because there's a lot of history to this thing. With the rear underbody in place, there's only one final detail that I want to knock out for this episode, and that means putting the wheels in place.
Is it premature to put wheels and tires under it? Absolutely. Is that going to stop me? Absolutely not. And to be clear, this tire size, way bigger than what these cars ran originally. Width-wise, it should be roughly the same. A little bit wider, but sidewall, really tall. So obviously that doesn't fit, even though we currently have 4 inches of ground clearance. So, and no, these aren't the final wheels. Believe it or not, we've got something even cooler in store. Is it correct? No, but it's close enough. All right, that's gonna be sick. That's gonna be sick. There's a lot that's not right about it. I mean, everything from everything. Loosely set up. And I had a lot of you guys going. Not that I didn't try to lie, I did. But I had a lot of you guys believing this was gonna be an M1. And to a degree, I wish it was. But what's better than a fake M1 is a real F40. I can't believe this is happening. It's gonna be nuts.
And that officially brings us to the end of episode 1, because episode 2 was technically filmed before episode 1, because it was first in order. That might be confusing, but hopefully not. Point is, up next, we've got to get a bunch of metal material into the shop and get started on actually building the chassis at hand. And we've got a lot of 3D scanning to do because I want to have scans of both the outside of these body parts and the inside for chassis design. It's going to be a bit before actually bending and cutting any metal, but next week's episode is going to be crazy because we're heading to Germany to buy an engine. And I think that episode 3 may even outshine episode 1 of this build series.
Now, last but not least for this episode, I want to answer some questions that you guys had in the comments of the last one, of which there were over 3,000. The response has been amazing. I can't thank you guys enough. Now, most importantly, a lot of you guys were kind enough to let me know, under no uncertain terms, that what I have here will never be a real F40 because I don't have a chassis and I don't have a VIN and I don't have an original F40 engine and all those other little details that you guys care a lot about. I want to make one thing clear. I don't care. If you want to see a normal F40, one of 1,300, yet another restoration, there are 1,300 of them to go see out there, each one the same as the next. And that's not what I'm after here. I'm building something that is one of one. And it's something that I believe, and I say this with all due respect, to an automotive legend, to Ferrari themselves. This is an incredible car. But I want to set out to build something that I believe is, in my opinion, better, faster, stronger, lighter, an improvement in every way because this car was built almost 40 years ago. There's a lot of time that's passed and we as a community have learned a lot. And guys like me are now capable of bringing some serious weight to the table. And that's what I want to do. I want to bring everything that I can to this build to build the best car possible. That's what we're setting out to do. Now, a lot of you guys have also said, I should make molds of this body because I paid a bunch of money for the real thing and you're worried about me damaging it or cutting up the hood or what have you. I get it. That's fair, but I'm not going to do that. One, there's already tons of people out there that have molds for this thing. If I wanted to have, I could have bought a complete carbon F40 body for a fraction of the price of what I paid for the real thing. It probably would have been higher quality than what I have here, but that's not what I want. I want the real thing. And plenty of you have said, why would you buy the real thing if you're not going to have the real thing underneath? Well, it's because I'm building what I want. I'm building my car here. If you want to decide what makes sense or what should be on my car, well, you can go build one for yourself that has a real chassis if that's important to you. What we have here is the real body because that's what Ferrari would have used if Ferrari went IMSA GTX racing or FIA Group 5 racing back at the end of the 80s. Only the body would exist and everything else underneath would go in the dumpster, they'd start from the ground up, and they'd build the best car they could. And that is what we're doing here. There's room for improvement literally everywhere else. But I want the body to be real because I want to build a real tube chassis F40 as said in episode 1. That tube chassis part of it tells you, I know I don't have the actual chassis, but that's because the actual chassis is basically the same thing that's underneath the 244, and we don't need that. We want to do better. We want to do stronger, lighter, and improve it everywhere we can. Now, last but not least, we got to talk about the engine. I asked you guys to take guesses at what's going in this car at the end of the last episode, and there's been some good guesses, there's been some bad guesses, some really bad takes. Let me be clear, I would never put an LS in this car. It's not getting a 2JZ. We gotta go way bigger and better than that. I'm only gonna put something in this car that is fitting for an F40, and I promise you that. There are no punches pulled, we're going all the way. There's been some good guesses too, like a Judd V10. That'd be neat, but I don't know if it's cool enough. We already have our engine. It's sitting on the table way back there. I'm gonna show you in the next episode. We had to go across the world to get it. We had to fly to Germany. We took the camera. We're gonna go on a full field trip in the next one. I'm gonna show you the engine. It's gonna be good. You guys are gonna love it. I'm pretty sure there will be no complaints about my engine choice. And if there are, too bad, so sad. I don't care. I'll see you guys next week.